The first thing I noticed was that the Vithali delegate had stopped breathing. Not metaphorically, not out of shock or some alien expression of surprise. He had literally physically stopped drawing air into his body. His gills slits, which normally fluttered in a soft rhythm along the side of his neck, were completely still. I had been watching him for exactly 43 seconds before I understood that this was not normal. I had been humanity's cultural liaison to the Galactic Council for 6 years. I had sat in this chamber through drought negotiations, through the RL and border hearings, through the 3-day philosophical debate about whether synthetic consciousness deserved a seat at the table. I had never seen a Vithali stop breathing. His name was Dalvos. He was 912 years old. He had served on the council longer than any living human had been alive, and he was staring at the projection screen above the central days, as if the universe itself had just told him something it should have kept secret. My name is Kale Morrow. I am 34 years old, born in Bristol, England, and on that particular Tuesday morning, I had walked into the grand deliberation chamber with a cup of cold coffee and a very specific expectation that the next 4 hours would be the most boring of my career. I was wrong about that. Cultural Transparency Accord had been in discussion for 11 years. The idea was straightforward. Every species in the council would submit a complete historical archive, fully translated, fully accessible to all member civilizations, art, science, philosophy, religion, and yes, conflict records. The reasoning was that genuine cooperation required genuine understanding, and genuine understanding required honesty about where each civilization had come from and what it had cost them to get there. 46 species had already submitted their archives. Humanity was last. We were always last at things like this, not because we were slow or disorganized, but because the council had quietly, politely, diplomatically found reasons to keep pushing our submission to the end of the agenda. I had noticed this pattern about 2 years in. I had never said anything about it out loud because I was fairly sure I understood the reason, and I was fairly sure the reason was embarrassing for everyone involved. They were afraid of what they would find that morning. Seated in the 3rd row of the human delegation section, I watched our archive begin its automated presentation. The system worked in chronological order. It always did. It started with the earliest recoverable records of human civilization and moved forward in time, displaying data, imagery, translated text, and contextual analysis at a pace the council's Zenorchavis had calibrated over 2 decades. For the first 12 minutes, everything was quiet and professional. Early agricultural settlements, domestication of animals, the development of writing, the first cities rising in the river valleys of the ancient world. The Vithali delegates took careful notes. The Kororin, who experienced time differently from most species and therefore found historical archives almost meditative, sat with their eyes half closed in what I had learned to recognize as deep concentration. The Orlan shimmered with gentle golden tones, which meant they were comfortable and engaged. Then the archive reached the first recorded large-scale armed conflict between human groups. I watched Dalvos go still. It was not the imagery that did it. The early records were fragmentary, mostly reconstructed from archaeology and linguistic analysis. There were no photographs of ancient battles. There were diagrams. There were translated accounts from stone tablets and papyrus. There were estimated casualty figures, rendered in clean neutral graphs. Nothing visceral, nothing that should have triggered that response in a delegate who had, by his own account, reviewed the war records of 31 other civilizations without incident. What stopped him was the graph. It was a simple bar graph. On one axis the year, on the other axis the estimated number of human beings deliberately killed by other human beings within a given 50-year period. The bars started small. Then they grew, and they kept growing. And they did not stop growing for several thousand years. I had seen that graph before. Every human school child had seen some version of it. I had looked at it the way you look at a familiar piece of furniture, something you have long since stopped actually seeing. Sitting in that chamber, watching Dravas's gills go motionless, I looked at it properly for the first time in my adult life. It was a very large graph. Across the chamber I heard the soft, involuntary sound that Koruran delegates make when they're processing centers encounter data that does not fit their existing models. It is a sound somewhere between a low hum and a held breath. 3 of the 7 chin in the room made that sound simultaneously. The archive had not even reached the Bronze Age yet. I sat down, my cold coffee on the armrest beside me. I was no longer thinking about how boring the next 4 hours were going to be. I was thinking about Dalvas's stillness and the Koran hum and the way the golden shimmer had gone out of the Orlan delegates, entirely replaced by a color I had never seen them display before, a flat, pale, colorless gray like the light going out of a window. I did not know what that color meant. I would find out later. It meant grief, preemptive grief, the kind you feel when you already know the ending of a story and someone has just begun telling it to you. The archive moved forward. The bars on the graph kept growing. I sat very still and I watched the room begin to chain around me, and for the first time in 6 years I thought that I might have fundamentally misunderstood what it meant to be the human representative. A place like this. I had always thought my job was to help them understand us. Sitting there watching Dalvos hold his breath for the 43rd second, I started to wonder if what I was really here for was to watch us understand ourselves. The chamber was built to hold 600 delegates. That morning it held 412. It had been designed with acoustics that absorbed ambient noise and produced a sense of calm, a deliberate architectural choice made by the Koran engineers who had built it. The silence in the room at that moment was not the silence of the architecture. It was the silence of 412 living beings choosing all at once not to speak. Dravos finally breathed a long, slow, careful breath like a man testing the air after a fire. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes on the screen. The archive moved to the ancient world and the bars on the graph climbed higher and the room stayed silent, and I sat in the 3rd row with my cold coffee, and I began to understand slowly and with great discomfort that the most significant moment of my career, care, had started without anyone announcing it. I need you to understand something about the Koran before I tell you what happened next. They have been a space-faring civilization for over 4,000 years. Before that they spent roughly 8,000 years building what they call the Long Peace, a period in their history when their entire species, all 11 billion of them spread across 4 inhabited worlds gradually, collectively, consciously chose to stop fighting, not because they were forced to, not because some governing authority imposed it on them, because they decided, as a people, that the cost was too high, and the reasons were never good enough. It took them 8,000 years, generations of philosophers, legislators, teachers, parents, and ordinary people quietly redirecting the course of their civilization, 8,000 years of patient, grinding, exhausting work to become a species that no longer raised a hand against itself. They were very proud of this. They had every right to be. Council's head xenolinguist, a Quroran named Velisari, had been serving on this body for over 300 years. She was the one who had spent a decade calibrating the translation protocols for the Cultural Transparency Accord. She was the one who had argued most passionately that the archive system should be comprehensive, that partial histories served no one, that the Council could not build a genuine future on a selectively edited past. She sat in the front row of the Quroran delegation that morning. I could see the back of her head from where I sat. She was very still when the archive moved past the early civilizations and into the ancient world. I watched her reach forward and pick up her personal notation tablet. This was not unusual. Delegates took notes constantly. What was unusual was that she held the tablet for a long moment without writing anything, and then she set it back down. I had never seen Velisari fail to write something down. The archive was covering the Mediterranean world now. Translated accounts of conflicts between city-states, naval engagements, sea records. I knew this material. I had studied it in school the way all human children did, as a collection of dates and names and strategic movements. Here, in the chamber, the archive's translation system was rendering it in the conceptual frameworks of 37 different species simultaneously, mapping human ideas onto alien understanding in real time. One of those concepts was causing a problem. The Council's automated translationist flagged a term and paused the presentation for a 3-second clarification insert. This was standard procedure. The system did it any time it encountered a concept that had no direct equivalent in the majority of Council languages. The term it flagged was total war. The clarification insert explained that total war referred to a style of human conflict in which the entire resources of a state, including its civilian population, its economy, its agriculture, its infrastructure, and its culture, were directed toward the destruction of an enemy state's equivalent resources, including its civilian population, its economy, its agriculture, its infrastructure, and its culture. The goal was not to defeat an army. The goal was to make the enemy's continued existence as a functioning society impossible. The Quroran linguist, seated 2 rows behind Velisari, raised his hand and formally requested a pause in the presentation. His name was Ora Rubin. He was 140 years old, young by Quroran standards, considered something of a prodigy. He had published extensively on the conflict records of other Council species. He had once told me at a diplomatic reception that studying alien war history had given him a deep appreciation for how fortunate the Quroran were. He stood up when the pause was granted, and he said in careful, measured Council standard language that he needed clarification on a specific point, he said, is the archive, indicating that a single human political entity would deliberately direct harm toward its own civilian population in order to deprive an opposing political entity of an equivalent civilian population as a military resource. Our archive coordinator, a woman named Claire Hobbs, who had spent 15 years preparing the submission, said, yes, that was correct, or Ben sat down. He did not speak again for the rest of the morning. I watched the Austrian. They were clustered together in their delegation area, a group of 7, and they had been gently luminescent when the session began. The Orlenin communicated through bioluminescent patterns across their skin, a language of light that the Council's translation tech could only partially interpret, mostly capturing emotional states in broad intent rather than precise meaning. Their gold had gone gray in the opening minutes. Now, as the archive moved through the ancient and classical periods, the gray deepened, not darker, exactly, denser. Like a fog thickening. I had asked my Orlean cultural contact once what their gray meant. She had paused for a long time before answering. She said that gray for her people was the color of something you could not look away from, even though you wanted to. The archive was not slowing down. It was designed to maintain a steady pace, covering centuries in minutes, giving enough context for understanding without becoming a lecture. It moved through the fall of empires and the rise of new ones. It covered migration and displacement on a massive scale. It covered the records of cities that had ceased to exist, not because they were abandoned, but because they were deliberately and systematically destroyed. At one point, the archive displayed a translated first-hand account from a survivor of one such destruction. The account was approximately 2,000 years old. It described in plain and simple language what the survivor had witnessed. The chamber was completely silent while the account was read aloud by the archive's voice system. When it finished, Dravos spoke for the first time. He did not direct his words at any particular delegate. He spoke quietly, almost to himself in Vithali, and the translation came through my earpiece. Half-second later, he said, how long does this continue? Claire Hobbs, who was monitoring the archive from a side station, heard the translation in her own earpiece. She looked at me across the chamber. Her expression was not easy to read. She was a very composed person. Under normal circumstances, the kind of professional who had prepared for every question. She had not prepared for that one. I answered for her. I said to DeVos quietly, there are approximately 23 more centuries of material before we reach the modern era. DeVos turned and looked at me for a moment, then he turned back to the screen. The archive continued. What I want to tell you about the next hour is not the content of the archive itself, because the content was history, and history is something every educated person already carries some version of in their mind. What I want to tell you about is the room. The Vithali delegation was 12 individuals. By the time the archive reached the medieval period, not one of them was taking notes. They were all simply watching. Dravos had resumed breathing normally, but he had adopted a posture I had not seen from him before, both hands flat on the table in front of him, pressing down slightly as if he needed to feel something solid. The Koran were more difficult to read. They processed information internally in ways that did Not always surface in body language, but Velisari had picked up her notation. Tablet again, and this time she was writing. She was writing constantly. I could see the stylus moving from where I sat. I found out much later what she had been writing. She told me herself months afterward. She said she had been writing down every question she could think of, because she could feel her existing understanding of the universe becoming insufficient in real time, and she needed to put the discomfort somewhere. She said she filled 43 pages before the morning session ended. The Orlanin, whose gray had deepened steadily, produced a sound around the 2-hour mark that I had never heard from their species before. It was very soft, barely above the threshold of hearing, somewhere between a vibration and a note. Their cultural attach later described it to me as an involuntary communal vocalization, something that happened when their entire group experienced the same emotional state simultaneously, and the feeling had nowhere else to go. She said it happened maybe 3 or 4 times in a generation. The archive was covering the period of roughly 1,000 years in which organized human societies in every major region of the inhabited world engaged in recurring cycles of large-scale armed conflict, each cycle displacing, injuring, or ending the lives of human beings in numbers that grew with each iteration. The reason the numbers grew was also in the archive. Humans were inventive, the same ingenuity that built the aqueducts, the cathedrals, the trade routes, the universities also built better and more efficient tools for the purpose of conflict. The archive documented this parallel development with clinical precision. Here is the agricultural innovation. Here is the corresponding weapon innovation. Here is the bridge. Here is the siege engine. Here is the medical advance. Here is the instrument of harm that made the medical advance necessary. Ora Ruben, who had not spoken since his question about civilian populations, raised his hand a second time. He waited to be recognized. When the council chair acknowledged him, he stood again and said, very carefully, I want to confirm my understanding of the archive's methodology is this. Presentations showing concurrent developments are the constructive achievements and the harmful ones happening within the same societies, within the same generations, sometimes within the same individual human lives. Claire said yes. Orrin said thank you and sat down. Around him I could see other delegates processing that confirmation in their own ways. A group of fellow delegates in the far left section had clustered closer together, a behavior I recognized as their species' instinctive response to distress. The first representative, whose species had submitted one of the council's most peaceful historical records, a civilization that had experienced only 2 minor armed conflicts in its entire pre-spaceflight history, had her head lowered over the table in a posture that looked to my very human eyes exactly like someone trying not to cry. She was not crying for didn't cry, but she was the one who, when the archive paused at the end of its second major chapter for a systems check, looked across the chamber and found me with her eyes and held my gaze for a long moment with an expression I could not name then and still struggle to name now. It was not horror. Horror implies the person looking is safe from what they are seeing. It was something more personal than that. Something that said, I see you and I am trying to understand how you are still here. I looked back at Her and I did not know what to say, so I said nothing. The archive resumed. It was moving toward the 20th century now, and I was sitting very still in my chair, and every single person in that enormous, acoustically perfect, diplomatically neutral chamber was watching the screen, and the room was the quietest place I had ever been in my life. Outside, through the tall observation windows that lined the upper third of the chamber walls, the planet the council called home was doing what it always did, turning slowly under pale sun, its oceans blue-green and enormous, its clouds moving in their ancient patterns over continents that had never known a human footstep. Inside, 412 beings from across the galaxy were learning what it had cost us to make it this far, and I sat there and I felt for the first time in my adult life the full and unguarded weight of what I was, not a diplomat, not a liaison, not a representative, a survivor of something that should not have produced survivors. The archive kept moving, the room kept listening, and the silence that had started as stillness slowly became something else, something with texture and mass, and the particular quality of attention that only happens when a very large number of very intelligent beings are all at exactly the same moment, trying to hold something in their minds that is larger than the space they had prepared for it. I drank the last of my cold coffee, and I set the cup down, and I watched the screen, and I breathed, and I waited for what was coming. The 20th century started, and the room did not make a sound. I had been watching the chamber for almost 3 hours by then. I had watched delegates from 37 species move through every readable stage of collective emotional processing that alien body language could express. I had seen stillness and note-taking and communal vocalization and postural changes, and the particular quality of silence that falls over room when the people in it are no longer performing composure but are genuinely helplessly quiet. None of that prepared me for what happened when the archive crossed the boundary into the 1900s. It was not that anything changed dramatically in the first few minutes. The archive's pacing was the same, the voice system reading translated accounts was the same calm, neutral tone it had maintained throughout. The data visualizations were the same clean design that the council's Zenor Chavez had spent years refining. What changed was the density. In previous centuries, the archive covered decades and minutes. The 20th century required a different approach. The volume of documentation alone, photographs, film records, audio recordings, written accounts, official records, personal correspondence, medical data, survivor testimony, and demographic analysis was so vast that the archive had to compress aggressively just to present a functional overview. Even compressed, the data came faster. And because there were photographs now and recordings, the abstractions that had buffered the earlier material were gone. I watched the moment the first photographic documentation appeared on the screen. It was not graphic. The archive's ethical filters, which had been built by a joint human chore 7 years, had carefully selected images for historical significance rather than shock. The images shown were of people in ordinary settings who happened to be alive during events of enormous consequence. Soldiers in trenches, civilians at railway stations, families outside damaged buildings, doctors in field hospitals. The room responded in a way I cannot fully describe. The nearest word I have for it is recognition. Up Until the photographs, the alien delegates had been processing the archive as data, compelling data, disturbing data, data that challenged their existing frameworks and required their most careful attention, but data, something that had happened to a species they knew primarily as the newest, most junior members of a civilization they had built over millennia. Photographs made it immediate. Photographs showed faces. Dravos made a sound I had never heard from a Vithali. Before, it was very quiet. It was the sound of a person who has just understood something they were hoping not to understand. The archive moved through the first decade of the century. Then the second, it documented the industrialization of conflict in terms that the translation system rendered in whatever conceptual language each species could best absorb. For the Kororan who thought in systems, it rendered the information as cascading structural failures. For the Vethali who thought in relationships, it rendered it as the collapse of social bonds on a civilizational scale. For the Aslan who thought in patterns of light, the translation system produced something I was not able to directly observe but whose effect I could see in the way their gray went darker still, slower and heavier like a tide going out. The archive reached the middle of the century. Velisari stopped writing. I noticed because I had been watching the movement of her stylus as a kind of anchor, something steady and rhythmic in a room that was becoming increasingly difficult to sit in comfortably. When the stylus stopped, I looked up from it and at the screen, and I saw what she had seen, and I understood why she had stopped. The archive had reached the midpoint of the Second World War and was presenting the systematic documentation of an organized effort by one group of human beings to eliminate another group of human beings entirely based on their identity. The archive presented this with full documentation, the planning records, the logistical records, the survivor testimonies, the liberation records, the final casualty estimates. The translation system had struggled with this section. I knew it had because Claire had mentioned it in one of our preparation meetings 2 years earlier. She had said that the joint translation team had spent months trying to find conceptual frameworks in 37 alien languages for what the documentation was describing, and that in the end for most species there simply were no direct equivalent concepts. They had to build new ones, new structures in the target languages to hold an idea that those languages had never needed, the idea that a species would organize itself with tremendous efficiency and deliberate planning to eliminate portion of itself, not in the heat of conflict, not as a consequence of war. As a goal, a Vithali cultural delegate named Sir Viven, who sat 2 seats to the left of Dalvas, made the sound that Vithali make when they weep. I had heard it once before at the funeral of a Vithali council member 2 years earlier. It is a low resonant sound, not like human crying at all, more like a sustained vibration that comes from deep in the chest. It lasts only a few seconds and then stops. It was the only sound in the room. When it ended, the silence came back, but it was a different silence from before. The earlier silence had been the silence of attention. This silence was the silence of people who no longer trusted themselves to make noise. The archive moved forward. The war ended. The data showed the casualty figures. Then it showed the reconstruction figures. The Marshall Plan, the Nuremberg Trials, the founding of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I watched Velissari pick up her stylus. Again, she wrote for a long time. The archive moved through the second half of the century, the Cold War, the proxy conflicts across multiple continents, the development of weapons capable of ending human civilization entirely, and the simultaneous development of treaties designed to prevent their use. Independence movements, the civil rights movements, the famines and the responses to famines, the refugee crisis and the international frameworks built to address them, the environmental damage, and the agreements made to repair it. The century ended, the archive paused. I looked at the clock on my personal display. The session had been running for 4 hours and 17 minutes. No one moved. The council's session management system was programmed to insert a 5-minute break at the 4-hour mark. It had not done so because no one had requested it, and the protocol allowed the presentation to continue uninterrupted if the chamber remained in active attendance. Active attendance was defined as a majority of delegates remaining in their seats and oriented toward the presentation. Every single delegate in the chamber was in their seat. Every single one of them was oriented toward the screen. The break had not happened because 412 beings had collectively, without coordinating it, decided that they were not going to stop. I counted the seconds of silence. After the archive paused, I got to 17. Before anyone moved, 17 seconds of 412 people and the particular weight of everything they had just seen. The council chair Velissari stood. This was unusual. The chair typically conducted proceedings from a seated position, except during formal votes and opening addresses. She stood and she faced the chamber, and she was quiet for another moment before she spoke. She said in council standard, which the translation system rendered for all delegates simultaneously, I am going to ask the human delegation a question, and I want to ask it not as a procedural matter, but as a genuine question, because I have spent 300 years on this council, and I have reviewed the histories of 46 civilizations, and I need to understand something. She paused. She said, and yet here you are, was 4 words in council standard in the particular grammatical structure Kororan used for statements that contained both a history and a question. Those 4 words meant something like, given everything this archive has shown, given the full weight of what your species has done to itself across the entire span of your recorded history, you are nevertheless present. This chamber as a functioning civilization that has reached the stars. And I need you to help me understand how those 2 things are both true at the same time. The chamber was completely silent. She was not looking at Claire. She was looking at me. I had no speech prepared for this. I had no protocol. I had my cold coffee cup, which was empty, and my personal notation tablet on which I had written almost nothing all morning, and 6 years of diplomatic experience that had in no way equipped me for this exact moment. I stood up. I did not know what I was going to say. I stood up because sitting down felt wrong, because the weight of those 4 words required me to be on my feet to carry it properly, and because 300 years of someone else's careful, attentive, genuinely searching attention deserved to be met. Standing up, I looked at Velissari, I looked at Dravas, I looked at the Ossel in gray, and still I looked at Oraruban, who had not spoken since he Sat down ago, I looked at the FTH delegate who was still watching me with that expression I could not name. I said, I know, and then because two words were not enough, I said, give me a moment. Velisari nodded. She sat down. I stood there in the fourth row of the human delegation section in the grand deliberation chamber of a galactic council that had been building civilizations for thousands of years before my species figured out how to write, and I took a breath and I tried to find the words for the thing that I had spent my whole life knowing without ever being asked to explain. I had not slept the night before, not because I had known what was coming, but because I rarely slept well on session days, a habit left over from my first year on the council, when the anxiety of representing 8 billion people in an alien chamber had kept me awake most nights. 6 years later, the anxiety was quieter, but the habit of wakefulness remained. I tell you this because, standing at that podium in front of 412 delegates who had just spent 4 hours watching my species' history, I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I was tired in the way you get tired when something you have always known but never set out loud is being asked of you for the first time. Velisari had given me the floor without fanfare or procedural formality. She had simply sat down and waited. The chamber waited with her. This was not a vote. This was not a formal address. This was something the council's own procedures did not have a category for, because nothing in those procedures had anticipated the moment when a junior civilization's representative would be asked to explain to the oldest space-faring community in the known galaxy how it was possible to survive knowing what you had done. I walked to the central podium. My footsteps were very loud in that silence. I set my hands on the edge of the podium and I looked out at the chamber and I said, we wrote it down. Dravos tilted his head. Velisari. Stylus paused over tablet. I said, every species in this room, when you look back at your own histories, you find the things your ancestors did that you are not proud of. You have them. I know you do. Because 46 archives have already gone through this system, and every single one of them contained things the presenting delegation found difficult to include. I read the transcripts, but here is what I want you to understand about my species. We did not only do these things, we recorded them, we preserved them, we translated them into art and literature and philosophy and law, not to celebrate them, to carry them, because we understood somewhere in the long and painful education of our history that forgetting was not an option we could afford. I paused. The room was still. I said, after the worst event in our archive, the one that stopped Velisari writing for a full 30 seconds, a group of human beings who had survived it stood in a courtroom and put the people responsible on trial. Not a military tribunal, a court of law, with judges and evidence and the legal presumption of innocence. They built a framework of accountability from the wreckage of the most catastrophic organized harm one group of humans had ever directed at another. While the rubble was still warm, Orarubin was writing now. He had taken out his notation tablet again, and his stylus was moving quickly. I said, then the nations that had just finished the deadliest conflict in our history sat down together and wrote a declaration. Not a treaty, a declaration. It said that there were certain things that Every human being was entitled to simply because they were human, not because of where they were born or who governed them or what they believed or what they looked like. It said that these things were universal and that the nations of the world were accountable to them. They called it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was adopted in 1948, 3 years after the end of the war. 3 years. I heard something across the chamber. I could not identify the species. It was a soft sound, not distress exactly, more like the sound of someone taking in information that requires their whole body to process it. I kept going. I said, we have poets who wrote about war, not to make it beautiful, to make sure no one forgot what it costs. One of them, a man named Wilfred Owen, wrote about watching a soldier die from a gas attack during the first of the two world wars you saw this morning. He wrote it in detail. He published it as a warning. He died in combat 1 week before the war ended. His mother received the telegram informing her of his death on the morning the armistice bells were ringing. His poems are still in our school curricula. Children still read them because we believe that the person who understands the cost of something is less likely to repeat it, and we will do whatever it takes to produce that person. In every generation, Belisari had put down her stylus. She was simply watching me. I said, we are not peaceful because we evolved past the capacity for harm. We did not. We carry that capacity the way we carry our own biology, and we know it, and we are honest about it. At least, when we are being our best selves, we are peaceful when we manage to be, because we have read enough of our own history to be genuinely afraid of what we are capable of, and we have decided that fear is a reasonable thing to live with and act on. I stopped. I had not planned any of this, and I was not sure I was done or whether I should be. The chamber waited. I said, there is a phrase in one of our languages. It is not from English, which is my own language. It comes from Yiddish, a language that nearly ceased to exist during the period you saw documented in the archive this morning, a language kept alive specifically because the people who spoke it refused to let it die. Phrase is a mensch. It means a person of integrity, a person who does the right thing because it is the right thing, not because they are incapable of doing otherwise, because they choose. I looked at Dravos. I said, we are not a species of mensches. We are a species that knows what a mensch is, has written the concept down in 100 languages, teaches it to every generation, and tries. We fail constantly. We fail in documented, archived, historically recorded ways that are now part of this council's shared knowledge, but we try. And we have been trying for as long as we have been writing things down, and we are still here trying. I stepped back from the podium. The silence was different now. It had a different quality from any of the silences that had come before it. The earlier silences had been the silences of people absorbing something. This silence was the silence of people deciding what to do with what they had absorbed. Belisari stood again. She said, thank you, Ambassador Marrero. She said it in council standard, and also I realized after a moment in English. I scented careful, deliberate English. I had not known she spoke it. I nodded and returned to my seat. Claire was watching me from the side station. She was not trying to hide the fact that her eyes were bright. She was Claire Hobbs, 15 years of archival preparation, and she was not going to cry in the grand deliberation chamber of the Galactic Council, but she was allowing herself to be visibly moved, which for Claire amounted to the same thing. I sat down. I picked up my empty coffee cup. I put it back down. The archive had one chapter remaining. The 21st century. Early space flight, the first contact. Protocols, the long process of interstellar communication, the negotiations for council membership, the 40 years of preparation that had preceded humanity's admission to the body, and then the 6 years since. But the council chair did not resume the archive. Instead, Velisari called a formal recess, the first recess in a session that had already run nearly an hour past its scheduled end. She announced that the final chapter of the Human Archive would be presented at the following day's session. She said this was to allow delegates time for reflection and note completion. No one argued, no one requested otherwise. As the chamber began to move quietly and slowly, the way a room moves when the people in it are carrying something heavy, I sat and watched the other delegates gather their things. The Vithali delegation moved in a group, speaking in low voices. The RLN were still gray, but it was a softer gray. Now less like fog, more like early morning. Or Ben stopped at the edge of the Corin section and looked across the chamber at me for a moment. He did not say anything. He gave a very slight nod, the kind that means I understand now something I did not understand before. And then he turned and walked out with the rest of his delegation. Dravas was the last Vithali to leave. He passed within a few meters of where I was sitting. He stopped, he said, in Vethli, which came through my earpiece as the phrase you used, the mensch. I would like a fuller definition in writing if you are able. I said I would send it to his office that evening. He nodded. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said, "You were right that it is a reasonable thing to live with," and he walked out. I sat in the emptying chamber for a long time after the last delegate left. Claire came over eventually and sat in the seat beside me, and we were quiet together for a while, which was something we had learned to do in the early years of the archive preparation, when the material got to be too much to process out loud. Eventually she said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I think I need to call my mother." She said, "Yeah." She picked up my empty coffee cup, looked at it, and set it back down. "Yeah, I think you probably do." The vote on the Cultural Transparency Accord was scheduled for 3 weeks after the final chapter of our archive was presented. I spent those 3 weeks in a state of careful professional uncertainty. I had been in diplomatic roles long enough to know that the space between a significant moment and its formal outcome was where things most often went wrong, where the weight of what had been felt in a room slowly gave way to the ordinary friction of institutional mechanics. I had seen it happen with smaller things than this. Proposals that had produced real emotion in the chamber but stalled in committee. Agreements that felt certain in the moment and then spent years in procedural limbo. I prepared for that. I wrote contingency language. I met with the delegations I thought were most likely to raise objections, and I listened to their concerns carefully, and I took notes, and I was a good diplomat, which mostly means being a good listener, who is also comfortable with long silences. But something was different this time, and I started to understand what it was. About 10 days after the session, when Oruru Ben sent me a Message, he was a researcher as well as a delegate, and the message was an excerpt from a paper he was writing, not a formal communication, just a passage he wanted me to see. He had been reviewing the archives of all 47 council species, including the newly completed human submission, looking for parallels and divergences in how civilizations documented their own conflicts. His finding, which he described in the careful, precise language of a Koran scholar, was this: humanity was the only species in the council whose historical record contained a consistent, sustained, unbroken tradition of individuals within the culture publicly criticizing the culture itself during periods of conflict, and having those criticisms survive and become part of the canonical record. Other species had dissenters. Other species had philosophers who questioned the justness of wars and policies, but in most cases those voices had been preserved selectively after the fact, once the culture had moved past the events in question and could afford to include the criticism. Retrospectively, human dissent was different. The poets who had written against wars did so while the wars were happening. The lawyers who had argued against policies of organized harm had argued against them in real time, often at significant personal cost. The journalists who had documented atrocities had documented them as they occurred, not as history, and the culture had kept these voices not as curiosities but as central texts, as required reading, as the literature that every generation was expected to know. Ora Rubin's note ended with a sentence I have thought about many times since he wrote: the preservation of self-criticism appears to function in human civilization as an immune system functions in biology. It does not prevent the organism from becoming ill, but it creates the conditions for recognition and recovery. I read that 3 times, then I sent him a message back that said simply, "Yes, that is it. Exactly, and thank you." On the day of the vote, I arrived at the chamber early. This was unusual for me. I was not by nature an early arriver, but I had not slept well the night before, and lying awake in my quarters thinking about contingency language had seemed less productive than walking the long corridor to the chamber and sitting as quiet before anyone else arrived. Chamber was empty when I got there. The lights were on their procession setting, softer than full brightness, and the air had the particular quality that large, empty rooms have early in the morning, clean and neutral and full of potential. I sat in my usual seat. I put my coffee on the armrest. This time it was hot. I looked at the presentation screen, which was dark and blank, and I thought about what it had shown 3 weeks ago, and I thought about Dravos's breathing and Velizer's 43 pages of notes, and the Orleans's gray, and the sound of Sir Van weeping for 3 seconds in the middle of 412 people's silence. I thought about Owen's poems in school curricula, and the Nuremberg courtroom, and the bells ringing on the morning of the armistice, while a mother read a telegram. I thought about what it meant to be the kind of species that produces all of those things from the same history. The chamber filled slowly. Delegates arrived. In their groups, settled into their sections, greeted each other in the quiet ways that early morning permits. The Vithali took their seats. Dravos arrived last among them, as he usually did, and he settled into his chair with the deliberate movements of a very old being who has learned to treat his own body carefully. He did not look in my direction. the Orlen arrived together. Their color that morning was a pale warm amber, which I had never seen from them. In a council session before, their cultural attaché had once described amber to me briefly and almost in passing as the color of something you have decided to keep. Velisari called the session to order at the appointed time. She reviewed the procedural requirements for the vote, which was a formality everyone in the room already understood. She asked if any delegation wished to make a statement before the vote was cast. 3 delegations requested the floor. The Kororan were first. Oruru Ben stood and read from his paper the passage about the immune system and self-criticism. He read it slowly and precisely, and when he finished he said that the Kororan delegation was voting in favor of the accord and considered the Human Archive submission to be among the most significant documents the Council had received in the modern era. The Vithali were second. Dalva stood. He was brief. He said that the Vithali had spent 3 weeks in internal deliberation about the implications of the Human Archive and that their deliberation had produced a conclusion he wished to share with the chamber. He said, "We spent 8,000 years becoming what we are. We have never stopped being proud of that. The Human Archive has not diminished that pride. It has changed its nature. We are proud of what we chose to become, but we did not have to choose against as much as they did. That is not a point in our favor. That is a point in theirs." He sat down. The third delegation was the Orellen. They did not have a speaker in the traditional sense. Their method of formal address was a pattern display, a specific sequence of bioluminescent changes that the translation system rendered as text. The delegate who stood to deliver it was a young member of their group, someone I did not know well. The pattern she displayed and the translation that came through my earpiece was, "We study light to understand what we cannot see directly. We have studied you for 3 weeks. We vote yes." The vote was called. It was unanimous. All 47 civilizations. Not a single abstention, not a single procedural objection. In 300 years of council operations, a unanimous vote had occurred exactly twice before, both times on matters of species-wide emergency. The cultural transparent. Gord paused and the chamber made a sound, not applause. The council did not applaud, but a collective exhalation, a release of something that had been held for 3 weeks and could now be let go. I sat in my chair and held my hot coffee in both hands and felt the warmth of it through the cup, and I breathed. Claire was across the chamber. She caught my eye and gave me a very small nod that meant everything was all right, which was her way of saying that something had gone exactly right, and she was going to allow herself to feel good about it for exactly as long as it took her to write up the official report, and then she was going to move on to the next thing. That was Claire. I had learned to love that about her over the years. After the session formally closed, as the delegates gathered their things and the chamber began to empty in that quiet post-vote way that always felt slightly unreal, a young Vithali aide approached me in the aisle beside my row. She was new to the delegation. I had seen her once or twice but did not know her name. She looked nervous in the way that junior staff look nervous when they are about to say something to someone they are not sure they should be saying something to, who's holding a data tablet and on it, visible as she extended it slightly, Toward me was a translated title page. It was the council's translation of a human book. The translator information listed on the page identified it as a 40-year translation project completed by a joint Quran linguistics team. The title, rendered in careful council standard, was something like All Quiet on the Western Front. She said in council standard with careful pronunciation. I requested a loan from the council library. They said I was the first non-human to request a specific human literary work by title. I want to read it, but I wanted to ask you first if it is appropriate. I do not want to read something that is private to your people. I looked at her for a moment. She was young, whatever age that translated to in Vithali years. She read as young to me, eager and uncertain and trying very hard to do the right thing. I said, nothing in that book is private. It was written to be read. It was written specifically so that people who had not been there could understand what it was like. That is exactly what it is for, she said. Divas told me it is the kind of book you write about, something you are ashamed of and love at the same time. He said he learned that phrase from you. I had said something like that in my address to the chamber. In different words, it surprised me that it had traveled. I said, he is right. She said, how do you love love? Something you are ashamed of. I thought about it. I said, you love what it cost. You love the people who paid that cost, and you love the ones who were honest enough to write it down so you would never forget. She held the tablet a little closer. She said, thank you, Ambassador Marrero, and she walked away through the emptying chamber, holding the book. I stood there for a moment watching her go through the observation windows above. The planet was turning in its slow orbit, clouds moving over oceans no human had attached, under a sun that had been burning for longer than our species had existed. I took out my personal communicator. I scrolled to a contact I had not called in 3 weeks. The name listed simply as Mom. The local time at her address in Bristol was early morning. She would be awake. She was always awake early, had been since I was a child, a habit she said she had gotten from her own mother and had never been able to break. I called her. She answered on the second ring. I said, hi, Mom. She said, Kale, what's wrong? I said, nothing. Nothing is wrong, she said. Then why are you calling at this hour looking like that? I had forgotten she could see my face on the screen. I looked at myself for a moment in the small reflected image in the corner of the display. I looked tired. I looked like someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had just set it down in a place where it would be safe. I said, I just wanted to tell you something. She said, tell me. I said, I'm glad we write things down. She was quiet for a moment. She knew me well enough not to ask me to explain. Immediately, she waited. Then she said, so am I, love. So am I. The clouds moved over the ocean. The chamber behind me was almost empty now. Somewhere in the council library, a young Vithali was opening a book that a dead man had written in a dead language about the thing that should not be forgiven and must not be forgotten. I talked to my mother for a long time, the kind of long time you can only manage when you have run out of anything more important to do than simply be present with someone you love. We talked about small things, the weather in Bristol, the progress of her garden, the particular difficulty of a recipe she had been attempting. We did not talk about the archive or the vote or the chamber or the 412 beings who had sat in silence for 17 weeks. Ago, those things would be in my official reports, they would be in Velisari's notes, all 43 pages of them. They would be in Aurubin's paper, which would be published and read and debated. Across 37 civilizations, they would be recorded, they would be kept. That was what we did. That was the oldest and most human thing I knew how to say about us. We kept going, we kept writing. We kept the evidence of our worst moments, not as monuments to shame, but as maps, detailed and honest maps of the territory of what we were capable of, so that every generation could navigate by them, could know where the edges were, could read the warnings written by people who had been to those edges and come back and picked up a pen. I told my mother I loved her. She told me to get some sleep. I said I would try. I walked out of the grand deliberation chamber of the Galactic Council into the long corridor that led back to the human delegation offices, and the lights were bright and my coffee was long cold. Again, and somewhere behind me the vote was already being written into the Council's permanent record in 37 languages, unanimous, the word for it, the same in all of them, S.